In this section, we'll look at the economy of the 1920s. If the United States was a little more conservative in politics, if it didn't really have the faith in government, and it was a little more neo-isolationist in foreign policy, it was definitely booming. It definitely had a booming economy. It was often called the Roaring Twenties or the New Economic Era. You can see this in a number of statistics. For example, here you can see on the left-hand side the boom in per capita income. Economists like to sum up everything that America produces, and they call this the gross national product, and that's goods and services, and it includes trade. If you look at the GNP, the gross national product, it was $69.6 billion in 1921, but it had risen to $103.1 billion in 1929. You can see on this graph the peak of that decade here on the left at how high the gross national product was. It rose an average of 5% per year throughout the entire decade of the 20s. Well, you think if you have 3 or 4%, it's considered good, but it went 5%. As you can see in this graph, there was a boom in the nation's manufacturing output. In the 1920s, the nation's manufacturing output rose more than 60%. And it was there were short slowdowns in 1924 and 1927, but there weren't any upheavals, and inflation remained negligible throughout the period. It was just people were making a lot of products. Now, there are a number of reasons that caused this economic boom after the initial 1921-22 recession that was mentioned in the World War I topic. At the end of the war, certainly Europe was completely destroyed. And Europe needed things, and it couldn't make it themselves. And so the United States was the only true industrial power remaining and had to provide everything the world needed until certainly Europe rebuilt. And that was quite an economic opportunity for American business. Another cause of the boom after World War I was the Dawes Plan and its Revision and Young Plan. You recall that after the war, the United States was able to lend money to Germany, which allowed Germany to make its reparation payments to Britain and France, which allowed Britain and France to make its wartime loan repayments to the United States. So it actually worked in everybody's advantage, and it also helped Germany, Britain, and France rebuild their economies and sort of trade with the United States. So the Dawes Plan was another reason that the United States economy recovered quickly. Another reason for the boom was the fact that there's a lot of cheap and readily available sources of energy. New oil reserves had been discovered, and the nation had been conserving for the war. When the war ended, it had a lot of excess supply, and there's also better and more excavation of coal. You see a tremendous boom in hydroelectric power in the 1920s, and a number of new dams are built. Probably the most famous is the Hoover Dam, which by the 1970s was producing 1 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually. And certainly there's also better networking of private electric companies. Increasingly, towns were added, more became online. Probably another cause was a change in public attitudes. The public no longer saw business as bad. Now we had what one people called the cult of business. Now you got to think, in progressive era, polls indicated that the public saw wealthy owners of businesses or industries as greedy and evil. Big business and industry was bad for the U.S. Now the attitude was, hey, big business industry is good. There's more sort of connection between hard work and a godly life. God rewards workers. The righteous will succeed. Big businessmen were often seen almost as divinely sanctioned. Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy made it seem like getting rich was part of the plan, and the rich people gave something back, the gospel of wealth, and they gave private donations. And so, it was a good public relations thing for the wealthy. You can see this in one book by Bruce Barton, who wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows, which portrayed Jesus Christ as a very good businessman. In a sense, he started with an organization of only 12 employees, and he came to employ millions. It was kind of saw Christ as an ad man. It wasn't really seen as sacrilegious at the time. In general, what you see in this period is business provides something that, people need, and that's good. In the 1920s, large businesses industry gave people what they wanted. A lot of improved domestic products were around, and business isn't bad. In general, people felt that if enough abundance was available, then everybody could participate despite problems. The pie would get bigger for everybody. A Ladies' Home Journal article by John Raskop in 1929 kind of summed this up, and it read, quote, "If a man saves $15 a week and invests in good common stocks and allows the dividends and rights to accumulate, at the end of 20 years he'll have at least $80,000 and an income from investments of over $400 a month. He'll be rich. I am firm in my belief that anyone not only can be rich, but ought to be rich." Raskop, by the way, was vice president of General Motors. Helping the whole economy run smoothly was a new prevalent attitude by industry leaders. You might call it welfare capitalism. Business leaders sort of modified their approach towards workers. It wasn't as harsh. The business leaders would use the carrots as well as a stick. Remember how labor had such problems at the end of the war and all those strikes in 1919, 1920? Well, businesses still opposed unions, but they promised now to work with workers on hours and wages. You actually see the first development of company pensions in this period. The employers weren't as inflexible, and that made for a peaceful and arguably a more productive work environment. There's also more use of scientific management in business, which was sort of pushed by a guy named Frederick W. Taylor. It used cost accounting systems and better bookkeeping. There a little more regimentation. There were things like time clocks for workers, but it also included things like incentive wage systems. If you produce more, the workers themselves get more. There was also increased consolidation industry, which in many respects can spur economic growth. Large businesses, for one, can pour more time or effort and money into research and development of new products. Today, of course, inventors of major new medicines are not doctors, but research scientists working from pharmaceutical companies. The chemical industry at the time was working on the development of plastics, for example. As corporations grew, they began to be big enough to diversify their products according to regional markets, and still kept the national economic strategy, both stimulating growth. The 1920s saw big growth, but in capital goods, but also it saw growth in consumer markets. Consolidation can, of course, run out smaller businesses, but growth always sort of creates new jobs. And regardless, the public was really optimistic of the new products. You see this growth in this consolidation was the expansion of department store chains. For example, you begin to see big chains like the A&P grocery store chain, or the Woolworths department store, and Sears and Roebuck Company, and so forth. During the Industrial Revolution, single banks had begun to consolidate. You might think of the bank of J.P. Morgan and so forth. But this process really picked up speed during the 1920s and helped provide, again, additional sources of capital for the industrialist. Earlier, smaller banks simply made sure-bet loans to families and so forth. But now the economy was booming. There's so much extra capital looking for new investments. There was plenty of money for startup businesses, and banks could make tremendously large loans. In 1900, fewer than 100 banks operated in more than one office. By 1929, over 800 did. The consolidation even led to the creation of holding companies, and this was when one corporation led by a board and owned by stockholders would buy up another corporation, another board, and another set of stockholders, and so it became a gigantic conglomerate. You see this in a number of ways. In 1902, for example, J.P. Morgan consolidated 6 competing companies into International Harvester, which controlled almost all of the farm implementation business. This concludes the section on the overview and the causes of the economic boom in the 1920s.